Carl Jung's final message about empaths may shake everything you thought you knew about compassion. He believed the empath is not a mystical gift bestowed at birth, but something far more human and far more tragic. At the root, the empath is simply the child who was never allowed to be selfish. That child learned to survive by absorbing the moods of others, by fixing their pain, and by silencing their own needs. That endless urge to care for everyone, to carry their emotions, to vanish so others could shine, it isn't always a gift. More often, it's survival programming, written into you, when your feelings were too much, your needs were too demanding, and your presence was only tolerated if it made others comfortable. But here's the part that makes Jung's insight revolutionary. He didn't view empaths as broken people. Instead, he saw them as being midway through a powerful psychological process. He called individuation the journey of becoming a whole, authentic self. Deep down, you already sense this. You've always known your empathy came with a cost, even if you couldn't name it. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And yet, if you're an empath, you've likely felt that your true self was never allowed to exist, that your authenticity had to be sacrificed to keep others comfortable. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your sensitivity feels like both a blessing and a burden. You'll see the psychological patterns that transformed your natural empathy into a survival strategy. And most importantly, you'll discover what Jung's teachings reveal about reclaiming something I call sacred selfishness, the kind of healthy boundaries that turn empathy from an unconscious compulsion into a conscious choice. This is not about becoming cold or less caring. It's about finally allowing yourself to care for your own well-being with the same intensity you've always given others. Jung noticed something that most people miss about how empathy develops. What we call empathy in adulthood often begins as emotional hypervigilance in childhood. Imagine a child whose sense of safety depends on constantly scanning the emotional states of their parents or caregivers. This child learns to detect moods before a word is spoken. They become the family's emotional radar, anticipating storms before they hit, smoothing conflicts before they explode, silencing their own needs to keep the household stable. Jung called this premature ego adaptation, when children develop advanced psychological skills, not because they're thriving, but because they're surviving. Their nervous system becomes like a seismograph, registering every tremor in the environment. This isn't a conscious choice. It's adaptive wiring. The child's brain literally reorganizes itself to maximize survival in an unpredictable, emotionally volatile home. And through this adaptation, the child develops what Jung described as psychological antennae, an uncanny ability to sense what others feel and need. But Jung also saw the cost. These children had to suppress what he called their authentic selfishness, the natural, healthy self-assertion every child needs to form a strong identity. He wrote, "The healthy individual is able to love himself as much as he loves others." Yet, empaths in the making learn the opposite. Love others more than yourself because your needs are dangerous. If you were the child who could read the room before you could even read words, you know this pattern intimately. This creates what I call the empathic paradox. The very sensitivity that makes you so attuned to other people also blocks you from truly knowing yourself. You become fluent in other people's emotions, but remain a stranger to your own. And while this adaptation is brilliant for surviving childhood, it can become destructive in adulthood. The child, who wasn't allowed to be selfish, grows into an adult who struggles to set boundaries, to voice needs, or even to believe they deserve care at all. Jung made a startling discovery about what gets buried in the unconscious of people who live this empathic pattern. In the shadow, the rejected parts of the psyche, he found not only anger, resentment, or guilt, but also what I call forbidden selfishness. That forbidden selfishness is the natural self-advocacy you were told was unacceptable, saying no, demanding respect, putting yourself first, expressing anger, even admitting you have needs at all. Most empaths carry heavy guilt about their shadow because it contains everything they were trained to believe was bad. But Jung argued, these impulses aren't pathological. They're the missing pieces of a complete personality. Without them, the empath becomes what Jung described as a wounded healer, someone who gives endlessly, but from emptiness rather than fullness. Here's the truth Jung uncovered that few want to admit. Many empaths unconsciously resent their own compassion. They give and give, but beneath the surface simmers exhaustion and suppressed rage. A part of them longs to stop caring, to walk away, to finally choose themselves. This isn't because empaths are bad people. It's the psyche trying to restore balance. Jung's compensation principle shows that when one side of the personality is overdeveloped, the opposite quality pushes its way into awareness. He also described what he called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when pushed to extremes. The person who never says no eventually explodes. The caregiver who never rests eventually collapses. The empath who denies their shadow becomes bitter. For Jung, integrating the shadow wasn't about becoming selfish. It was about reclaiming your right to exist as a whole human being. He believed the empath's shadow contains their sacred selfishness, the healthy ego strength that makes authentic relationships possible. If you've ever felt guilty for wanting to put yourself first, remember Jung's wisdom. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. For the empath, that darkness isn't cruelty. It's the radical act of believing you matter just as much as everyone else. Jung identified a specific turning point in the life of every empath, a moment when the psyche demands change. He called it the individuation imperative, the inner command to become who you actually are, rather than who you were forced to be. This often shows up as empathic burnout. And burnout isn't just fatigue. It's a deep, soul-level exhaustion. Suddenly, you can't fake caring anymore. The problems that once fueled you now feel heavy, even meaningless. You begin resenting the very thing that once defined your identity, your ability to help. Jung saw this not as failure, but as emergence. The authentic self is trying to break free, but that means dismantling the false self that was built on self-abandonment. Here, Jung's concept of the transcendent function becomes critical. This is the psyche's way of uniting opposites. In this case, the caring self and the self-caring self. Integration doesn't mean choosing one over the other. It means creating a whole self that contains both. But this process can be terrifying. People around you might say, "You've changed," or accuse you of becoming selfish. Jung called this differentiation anxiety, the fear that if you set boundaries, you'll lose relationships. Yet Jung made an important observation. The people who truly love you will support your growth. The ones who resist were likely benefiting from your lack of boundaries. This is why individuation requires what I call developmental courage, the willingness to disappoint those who preferred you diminished. If you've been told you're different, since setting boundaries, remind yourself, I didn't change, I just stopped hiding. For Jung, this individuation crisis was not just psychological, it was spiritual. He called it a spiritual emergency, the soul's urgent demand for authenticity. The empath who answers this call doesn't become less caring. They become consciously caring instead of compulsively caring. And this is where Jung introduced a concept that may change everything for you: sacred selfishness. This isn't narcissism. It isn't egoism. It's what Jung described as the ethical obligation to become yourself, to recognize that your first responsibility is your own psychological development. He wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." For the empath, this awakening means realizing that years of self-neglect, disguised as virtue, were never true compassion. They were survival strategies. Sacred selfishness is the turning point, where empathy becomes a gift instead of a prison. Sacred selfishness begins with what Jung called emotional sovereignty, the recognition that you are not responsible for managing other people's feelings. As a child, you may have learned that keeping others calm was the only way to stay safe. But Jung understood that taking on responsibility for the emotions of others actually stunts their growth while depleting your own. Emotional sovereignty allows you to step back and realize their moods are not yours to carry. The second pillar is boundary consciousness. Jung emphasized the importance of knowing where you end and where others begin. Many empaths blur these lines so completely that they can't tell whether the sadness or anger they're feeling belongs to them or to someone else. Boundary consciousness restores clarity. It doesn't shut out empathy. It allows empathy to be offered without losing yourself in the process. The third is need legitimacy. Jung observed that empaths often treat their own needs as optional, while treating everyone else's as mandatory. Sacred selfishness means declaring that your needs are not only valid, but essential. To deny them is to live only half a life. Jung believed that when empaths honor their needs, they actually become more helpful to others. They give from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than exhaustion, from choice rather than compulsion. This leads to what he called differentiated love, the capacity to love without erasing yourself. Jung also pointed out that empaths must practice what I call relational selectivity. Not everyone deserves access to your empathy. Not every request for help is genuine. Not every relationship that feels familiar is healthy. Empaths often confuse intensity with intimacy, need with love, and drama with depth. Psychological discernment is the ability to see people as they are, not as you wish them to be. Once developed, this discernment changes who you attract. You no longer draw people who exploit your empathy. You attract those who meet you as equals, those who are doing their own inner work. At first, this can feel lonely. Jung observed that breaking out of codependent patterns often creates a void because the old familiar roles disappear. But over time, this emptiness becomes fertile ground for authentic belonging. You begin forming relationships based on mutual respect instead of mutual need, reciprocity instead of dependency. This is the path toward becoming what Jung described as the integrated empath. The integrated empath has transformed their sensitivity from unconscious compulsion into conscious choice. They've developed what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing themselves in the process. They can turn their empathy on and off like a light switch, guided by intention rather than reflex. The integrated empath practices compassionate detachment. They care without carrying. They maintain what Jung called loving distance, close enough to help, far enough away to preserve perspective. Their relationships are reciprocal, not one-sided. They no longer feel drained by compassion because they no longer give from emptiness. Jung saw this integration as the very essence of individuation. The empath learns that their truest self includes both the capacity for deep compassion and the right to self-preservation. From this integration comes what he called earned security, a stable inner core that doesn't depend on the approval, the moods, or the validation of others. At this stage, the empath becomes a model for others. Jung believed that integrated empaths serve the collective good precisely because they demonstrate healthy boundaries, authentic relationships, and conscious compassion. They show that sensitivity can coexist with strength and that empathy does not require self-destruction. This journey from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy is what Jung described as the hero's journey of the psyche. Yet Jung also warned of what he called the integration temptation, the pressure to fall back into old patterns when others push against your new boundaries. Growth requires holding your ground, even when others accuse you of being selfish or say, not the same person anymore. Jung insisted that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And for empaths, that means honoring both sides of themselves, the part that cares for others and the part that demands care for themselves. At the deepest level, Jung's final insight about empaths was liberating. Your empathy was never about other people. It was about you, trying to feel safe in a world that felt unpredictable. Much of what you called love was really emotional management, controlling others' moods so you could feel secure. This realization can be painful, but it also sets you free. Once you see that your empathy began as survival, you can choose to transform it into authentic compassion. You are no longer a prisoner of programming. You become, in Jung's words, the author of your own psychological story. This freedom brings what I call authentic empathy. It's empathy born from love, not fear, from choice, not compulsion, from strength, not weakness. And yes, it often triggers what Jung described as existential guilt, the inner voice that says, "But I've always been the helper. What if no one loves me? If I'm not useful?" Jung called this identity grief, the mourning of a self that was never truly you, but felt familiar. It's the pain of letting go of the false self, so the real self can finally live. On the other side of this grief is liberation. Helping becomes meaningful again because it's voluntary. Compassion becomes lighter because it's offered freely. Jung called this the freedom paradox. When empathy becomes a choice instead of a duty, it becomes more powerful, not less. The empath, who integrates their shadow, claims their sacred selfishness, and develops authentic empathy, becomes what Jung called psychologically sovereign. They recognize themselves as the ultimate authority of their own experience. They learn to reparent themselves, to give the unconditional acceptance they never received, to honor their needs, to celebrate their existence without apology. Yes, this often involves grieving the unlived life, acknowledging the years you lost to pleasing others, the dreams you abandoned, the parts of yourself you silenced. But Jung saw this grief as sacred because it clears the ground for a new life. Out of that mourning emerges a stronger, freer self. And here is the final truth. Jung offered, your sensitivity is not your flaw. It's your unfinished development. The child, who was never allowed to be selfish, can grow into the adult who chooses when and how to give their gifts. Your empathy was never meant to enslave you. It was meant to be your superpower. When it comes from wholeness, it heals both you and the world. The next time someone calls you too sensitive or selfish or changed, remember Jung's wisdom. You are not too much for this world. You are simply enough for yourself at last. And that transformation from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy is exactly what the world needs. Not more people who give until they break, but more people who know their worth and give from overflow. Your journey is not about becoming less caring. It's about becoming consciously caring. Not about silencing your empathy, but about reclaiming it as your choice. Jung believed the world doesn't need more wounded healers. It needs integrated empaths, people who can love with strength, who can care with boundaries, who can serve without losing themselves. And that, he believed, is the privilege of a lifetime, to become who you truly are.